Okay, welcome. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Tom Landy. I'm the director of the McFarland Center for Religion, Ethics, and Culture, and this is our home in Ream Library. Welcome to it. The McFarland Center sponsors a whole range of conferences, lectures, special events on campus that foster dialogue on questions of meaning, morality, and mutual obligation. And you can find our talks online at holycross.edu/McFarland Center. And for those, I guess, who can't eventually get in the door, they'll find this a few days posted online. But you get to be here in person and ask some questions and engage in that, and I think that's a great opportunity. I'm delighted to join my colleagues from the Department of Economics and Accounting in sponsoring the event, and thank Professor Melissa Boyle, who is, there we go. Melissa's not as tall as I am, so she doesn't stand out quite as readily, who's the department chair. This year marks the 50th, or we're in the middle of a kind of hybrid year in between marking the 50th anniversary of coeducation at Holy Cross. That provided us with added incentive to look at the sources and impacts of social change affecting women's well-being. I'm really happy today to welcome a scholar who has devoted prodigious energy and intelligence to thinking about women's well-being and advancement. Professor Goldin and I have been actually talking about doing this talk for a long time while your book was in progress originally, and you said you wanted to finish before we did that. So I'm grateful to finally have you here and to have a great audience to learn from you. Claudia Goldin is Henry Lee Professor of Economics at Harvard University. She's co-director of the National Bureau of Economic Research's Gender in the Economy Study Group and was the director of the National Bureau of Economic Research Study Group and the American Economy Program from 1989 to 2017. An economic historian and a labor economist, her research covers a wide range of topics, including the female labor force, the gender gap in earnings, income inequality, technological change, education, and immigration. Most of her research interprets the present through the lens of the past and explores the origins of current issues of concern. Today we have a chance to learn about the work she's done in the book that I mentioned, Career and Family, Women's Century-Long Journey Towards Equity, which was published recently by Princeton University Press. Please join me in welcoming Professor Claudia Goldin.
Thanks. Thank you so much. It turns out that I'm not speaking on that book because I published that book in 2021, and we academics are always into a new thing, okay? And the new thing is what women want. So my presentation is about women's rights in the US after suffrage. So when did women's rights change in the US? How did they change? And why did they change? So why women won rights initially, and in some sense, ironically, had much to do with the civil rights movement. The women's rights movement awakened a large group of women and men to a set of wrongs. In an extraordinarily brief time frame, you will see, considerable legislation was passed and various judicial decisions bolstered the laws. But the passage of some legislation reinvigorated an anti-feminist, traditionalist movement that is with us today. By women's rights, I mean that the legal, political, and social rights of women are equal to those of men. I will include legal rights in the polity, in the workplace, school, family, marriage, credit, Social Security, and the military, as well as with regard to a woman's own body. I will talk mainly about the expansion of rights. It has been a challenge to identify the impact of workplace rights on women's earnings and promotion and their educational attainment. There are a few exceptions, and I note some of them in this slide, particularly one with regard to women's sports. I'm first going to tell the fascinating history of when women won. I'll then discuss how women won, Civil rights and women's rights have long been intertwined. In 1964, however, civil rights and women's rights came together, and a national women's rights movement emerged soon after. In the early 1960s, an overwhelming majority of Americans, men and women, thought women could be employed even if their husbands could support them, that women should be more politically active, and believe it or not, that a woman could become president. But it took far longer for a majority of men and women to agree that women could be employed if they had preschool-aged children, and that women should have an equal role in industry, business, and government. By the 1970s, after considerable legislation regarding women's rights had been passed, women were deeply divided by education, employment, family status, and geography, that part of the US, on issues regarding whether they should have an equal role and whether they supported the women's rights movement. Men, however, were not divided in the same manner. Now, when women hear or read the title of my paper, they come up to me and they say, "Really? We won? You must be joking." But not that long ago, really not that long ago, women were fired or demoted for being married, for getting married, for being pregnant, for having children, or even being capable of having children. There are famous Supreme Court cases on these subjects. They were denied credit and mortgages just because they were women. They had to use their husband's name on credit cards. They were treated differently than identical men by the IRS, the Social Security system, and the retirement rules of the federal government and the military. They had jobs that were advertised separately from those of men legally. They had restrictions on their work hours, on the types of jobs that they could take, and on the conditions of those jobs. They were harassed sexually as if that were normal behavior. They were not seated on juries in many states, or they had to deliberately opt into the system or were routinely exempted. So consider the fact that no one questioned why there were 12 angry men. Consider as well the Supreme Court decision in something called Hoyt versus Florida, decided in 1961. The most liberal of all Supreme Courts in the history of America, the Warren Court, the court that gave us Brown, gave us Miranda, gave us Griswold and Loving, as well as many other famous progressive cases, liberal cases, determined 9-0 that because women were, quote, the center of home and family life, they could be excused from jury duty, although that was not the case, according to these 9 justices for blacks. Yet from the 1960s to the 1970s, almost all these rights that I list here became guaranteed on paper through legislation and judicial decisions. By the way, Hoyt was found guilty of murdering her husband, and the jury was all male. So despite the glaring facts that women were not treated as the equals of men at work and in courts of law, in banks and schools, few in America thought that they were discriminated against, even though they may have thought the same about blacks. Consider this Google Ngram, and I take it that many of you know what a Google Ngram is. It's searching over a corpus of books for words that are related to each other. So consider this Google Ngram on racial discrimination. So I'm searching for the words racial discrimination or race discrimination, and it gives an index of the counts of books in the Google American English corpus that use the phrase at least once. Although this spikes in 1948 with the desegregation, Truman's desegregation of the armed forces, it reaches a new plateau with the civil rights movement beginning in 1958. Now add the same for sex discrimination. There is a 12-year lag, and sex discrimination as a term takes off around 1970, and that's either sex discrimination or gender discrimination. So that's for books. Let's look at newspapers. Consider the same exercise using a corpus of major U.S. city newspapers. Here, the spike for race discrimination is with the 1964 Civil Rights Act. Now add the same for sex or gender discrimination. There is also about a 12-year lag, and that takes off once again around 1970. So I now turn to a chronology. I'm going to take you on a trip from the early 20th century until today. And it's a chronology of the women's rights movement in the US. So the question is, what was the road from an economy and society in which women were legally treated differently from men to one in which such treatment is illegal? And when I say they were legally treated differently, we're not talking about the 19th century. We're talking about the latter part of the 20th century. We're talking about the 1950s, 60s, 70s, and even 80s, okay? So this wasn't long, long ago, although you may think it was long, long ago. It was long, long ago. So although I'm not going to go through the period of suffrage, I need to start in the year 1908 with a famous Supreme Court case, Muller versus Oregon. And that case began the legality of laws that protected women. These were championed by progressives, by some of the greatest liberal minds of the 20th century, like Louis Brandeis, pictured here. And they were championed to get a foot in the door for the union movement and for labor, and to constrain employers through laws that were illegal under a previous decision known as Lochner versus New York, 1905. And this is because they restricted the right of labor to contract freely. So Lochner said you couldn't pass these laws because it would restrict the right of labor to contract freely. But in fact, what happened in Muller versus Oregon was you were allowed to do it for women. So every state then passed protective legislation and regarding maximum work hours, types of work, amounts that could be lifted, necessity for seats at work, and this is only for women. So Lochner said you couldn't do it for everyone, and Muller said you could. Later in the 1930s, these laws were protective legislation, and maximum hours, minimum wages was allowed for everybody. So every state passed this legislation, and this was viewed by unions and most Democrats, most progressives, as necessary protections. Republicans, however, and business interests opposed these laws. But this would soon change, and an important and influential commission on women's status was appointed by JFK in 1961. He appointed this in part because women had become, in 1960, a pivotal voting constituency, and presidents had to realize that they had to appeal to the women's vote. The commission called for the passage of the Equal Pay Act, which had not been passed. It had been floating around Congress for decades. And it also supported the end to protective legislation, which it deemed as incontrovertibly discriminatory. It supported the use of the 14th and the 5th Amendments for sex when they had only been used for race in the past. And it also, though, did not support passage of the Equal Rights Act. Rather than that, it supported the use of the 14th and the 5th Amendment. As you can see here, you see a picture of Kennedy. Next to Kennedy is Eleanor Roosevelt, who was the chair of this commission. She died in 1962 before the commission finished. The commission was then taken over by the economist Richard Lester. The entire idea for this, though, came from Esther Peterson, who was the head of the Women's Bureau of the Department of Labor. Now, I would like to continue with this and bring us to the Civil Rights Act of 1964, where much of the story is going to begin. But what I must do is digress for a while, because a lot in America happened, a lot, in the 1960s. And I don't mean the Beatles, okay? But they did happen too. So let's go back in time. There was an incredible set of movements. It was a period of massive democratization and movements. There was, beginning in the 50s, the civil rights movement. And there was also the anti-war movement, and that was anti-Vietnam War. And what you see here is a picture of the largest US demonstration ever in American history. Now look really, really, really closely at all those people there. And if you look really closely, you'll see me. I gave this at a place the other day, and someone said, "Me too." I'm thinking, but I don't remember you there. Okay. Okay, so both of these movements gave women organizing talents and demonstrated that their issues were not being discussed. They learned that they too were oppressed. And this led to both a national movement and to more local grassroots women's liberation movements. They learned how to organize. They learned that they were not being treated as the equals of men in either of the movements. And they learned the word oppression. So now we can return to the main timeline. And I do not know what that dinosaur is doing there. So let's return, and we're going to return to the passage of the contentious Civil Rights Act of 1964. The Civil Rights Act was part of the Kennedy administration's agenda, but it had stalled in Congress. And after Kennedy was assassinated, LBJ pushed it forward. However, 2 days before the Civil Rights Act was voted on, the word sex was added to one of the titles, and that's the famed Title VII. And Title VII is the title that concerns employment. And it was added by the person pictured on the left here, Representative Howard Smith, Democrat of Virginia, a known segregationist. And he probably added it, we don't know, it's a complicated story, to defeat it, defeating the entire 1964 Civil Rights Act. But the few women who existed in the House had wanted to add it. And because the Equal Pay Act was passed in 1963, but that was only for pay, and that had nothing to do with other aspects of employment. So Representative Martha Griffiths decided that she would work on people in the House to get this through. And she noted that if black women were to be protected at work, white women should be as well. It's an interesting point that she made, and one that sort of appealed to the segregationists. So the act was passed. And what's interesting in looking at this history, and I'll note this at various moments, is that when acts were passed, they were passed overwhelmingly. This was a tremendous amount of bipartisanship. That is a word that you're not going to hear a lot of in the next week. So LBJ supported adding the word sex, and as I said, the law passed in 1964. The EEOC was established as the enforcing agency, but the EEOC took no stand on this. In fact, if anything, rather than taking action on account of sex, they mocked the commissioner of the EEOC, in fact, mocked the notion that he was the head of what he called a sex commission. It was to be a race commission, not a sex commission. And that led to the formation of the National Organization for Women Now, and now pushed for the passage of the Equal Rights Amendment and for real equality, and supported the end of protective legislation. What's really amazing is that at this moment, Republicans and Democrats are on in some sense, the flip sides of this issue. So Republicans and business interests support the passage of the Equal Rights Act because that would end protective legislation, which they didn't want because protective legislation was constraining industries and firms. However, on the other side, the Democrats, who you might have thought the Democrats and the liberals would be for the ERA, they were against the ERA because the ERA was going to get rid of protective legislation. It's sort of an amazing moment in political history. But that really didn't matter because Title VII had been passed. And as soon as Title VII was interpreted by the Supreme Court, protective legislation that singled out women was out the window. It was gone. And pretty soon, every state rescinded their laws concerning protective legislation. So with that, the ERA passed overwhelmingly, both sides, Republicans and Democrats, in 1972. 30 states ratified the ERA in 1 year. Roe versus Wade was decided in a tremendous surprise to liberals and to women's rights groups, was decided in January of 1973. So there were big wins for the women's rights movement. But with something to attack, the STOP, S-T-O-P, is not just stop, it's the acronym for Stop Taking Our Privileges. The Stop ERA and pro-life movements were invigorated, and you can see Phyllis Schlafly here, over here, and the ERA eventually died. Since 1971, since that sort of ends around 1971, 72, a lot has happened. We don't have time to go through all of these, but these are the big things that occurred in the 1970s, a few in the 1980s. To give you a sense of what went on with regard to laws and judicial decisions and various events, I have compiled what historians and legal scholars have determined were the most important moments, including, as I said, legislation, judicial decisions, major events, turning points, prominent individuals, and so on. And I aggregate them here to quinquennia every 5 years, so that it's not just a set of points and a wiggly line. I aggregate them in this graph. And what you can see is that 45% of them, so this is 155 moments, and almost half, 45% of them, occurred in this brief moment from 1963 to 1973. I put them in 4 categories because I thought perhaps some of them occurred earlier or later. It turns out that they're pretty synchronous here, so we don't have to worry about those. Now, what I want to do is sort of step back from this and think about this in terms of abstractions, a little bit of more theory. It's useful to think about the women's rights movement and the reinvigoration of an anti-feminist movement in terms of a very simple model. Underlying this framework is the notion that women are incredibly difficult to organize. They are in every family, that's for sure. I believe they're in every zip code, but I can't prove it. They're certainly in every income class. They're in every religion, race, ethnicity, and so on. They're difficult to organize. They do not see that much can be done until an organization appears. And once an organization appears that represents their preferences, they might do something about joining that organization. So what I'm going to do here is assume that individuals adhere to one of 2 principles, never both: equality or differences. Each woman has a unit of time to use for leisure or for working for a movement, either equality or differences. Call the first group feminists, for whom equality with men is highly valued, and call the other group traditionalists, for whom differences and protections are highly valued. The 2 groups initially have latent demands that get expressed when an organization is formed. So here I have what I call the equality PDF, the probability density function, and it gives the distribution of feminists by their demand for equality. So here would be a large amount of equality, and here would be a smaller amount of equality. Each feminist has a desired value of this. So let's say someone was over here. So as long as the level of equality is below this, this person would give this much time. She would give her 1 unit of time every time period to work for equality. So that's the woman at ERA. And so she's going to give her time if the level is below that. Therefore, if the ERA is passed, and let's say that that's over here by Congress, feminists from E0 to ERA will no longer give their time to the movement, and the movement will then appear to be more radical. It's an interesting way of thinking about why movements at some periods seem to embrace everyone, and then at some periods seem to be more radical. It's because individuals who feel that their needs have been met withdraw their time from the movement. Equally, similarly, each traditionalist, and I drew it this way, this goes in the positive direction this way, because if I drew it over here, it would make this side messier. So each traditionalist has a desired value of D and will work for differences when the level is below their desired level. This group also is difficult to organize, but was energized by the passage of the ERA and by the Roe decision and formed the Stop ERA movement. And so if once ERA is passed, individuals over here will get more active. Now, I'm going to turn for my last set of things that I want to say to what the nation's people, men, women, younger and older, thought of women's roles and women's rights. In some cases, the data that I have, these are public opinion polls and surveys. Many of them are very well known. You may have read some work that used some of these. So some of the data go back to the 1930s or 1940s, and others begin in the 1970s. Some of these opinion questions, as I said, are very well known, and I'll provide a useful summary very soon so that you can get a sense of putting all of this stuff together, because it's a tremendous amount of material. And the summary is going to give the year when the median person agreed with the question. The first three questions concern women's competencies. This one is, should a married woman work for pay? And so the way in which you can read this is the year that the question was asked. This is the group that I call the younger group, 20 to 34 years old, and this is the older group, 35 to 64 years old. The blue line is male, and the orange line is female. So in this case, you should be struck by how similar the answers are by sex and the large initial change that existed before 1970. Similarly here, with regard to this question, whether the U.S. would be better governed if women were more politically active, these questions began in the 1950s. What's fascinating about many of these public opinion polls that concern women is that the 1960s, these questions were not asked. And I think the reason was that there was far more interest in civil rights than there was in women's rights. So similarly here, with regard to whether the U.S. would be better governed if women were more politically active, these lines are pretty similar for most of the period, somewhat different for early on. But still, women were deemed as being extremely competent. And then the big surprise here is whether the individual would vote for a female president. And this was expressed in the surveys very carefully. It was if a competent woman, not just any old woman, ran for president in the party that you usually vote for, okay? So therefore, people weren't thinking, oh, she's in the other party. Would you vote for her? And you can see that with regard to whether the individual would vote for a female president, it becomes high very quickly in the 60s to the 70s and here as well for the older group. And by and large, for most of this period, from the 1970s on, it looks like a woman should have become president if she had been nominated. We know that that didn't happen. The next three questions concern whether women should be granted more equality. Should women be granted an equal role, this question asked, in business, industry, and government? And here we should be struck by the somewhat higher fraction of women agreeing with the question, but not that much higher, and by the generally low level of agreement until the 1990s. Similarly, for what is the warmth for the women's movement, that's the question being asked here. Not a lot of warmth for the women's movement until somewhat later in the 20th century. And finally, do you consider yourself a feminist? Not many people said that they considered themselves a feminist, which is very interesting because the question is, how were they thinking about the word feminist? Now, given the time, I want to summarize this material very rapidly and give you a good sense of what all of this means in terms of these median voters here. And so I can summarize this by giving you the year, and so here are all the years here from 1945 to 2005, giving you the year in which the majority of this group, we have four groups, male, female, younger, older, that's four groups, agreed with the statement. And generally, when you do this, you use little dots. But I decided that it would be better if I used chickens. And so a chicken is the older group, and blue are males, and a chick is a younger group. And here we have a young group of women, and here we have the older group of women. And where they moved to tells us the year that the median person in each of these groups agreed with the statement. So now let's put in the first three that I told you. Is it okay for a woman to work for pay even if she has an able-bodied husband? Should women be more politically active? Would we be a better nation if that were the case? Would you vote for a female president? You can see that they all crossed that 50% line, the median, before 1970. Now let's put in the others. This is one that I didn't give you, which is very important. Preschoolers, it's usually phrased the opposite. A preschool child would suffer if the mother worked. This, I've expressed it so that it's the same as these. This is preschoolers won't suffer. This is, do you agree to strengthen women's status? Do you have warmth for the women's liberation or the women's movement? Are you a feminist? And what you can see here in contrast, the year the majority of Americans agreed to give women more rights is much later. Similarly, for the year they agreed with the principles of the major women's rights groups and with their chief tenet, which is feminism, which here never exceeds 50%. Finally, I want to examine two of these questions in more detail. What we couldn't see in the graphs that I just showed you is that women were themselves greatly divided. Think back at my little framework, my little model. It had two groups of women who were, once an organization appears, come out and demonstrate and express their desire for protection and differences or for equality. So I want to show you how divided they were. For example, consider the question on equal rights. The means across all years from 1972 to 2008 are 47% for women. 47% say that that women should be granted more of an equal role. And 44% for men. It wasn't that different. But only 31% of women that I deem as traditional by they are not college graduates, they're 35 to 64 years old, they're currently married, and they're not employed. So I'm separating these two groups. I don't know if certainly all of those are not traditionalists, and all of this other group, non-traditionalists, they're college graduates, 20 to 34 years old, not currently married and employed. So what you can see here is that only 31% of the individuals with, I should say, traditional characteristics agreed with the statement, but 72% of those with what I would call non-traditional characteristics did. So within women, there's a great divide, but within men, there's hardly any great divide. So the difference for men is only 19 percentage points. And similarly, with regard to the women's movement question, the difference for women was much larger given these traditional or non-traditional characteristics than it is for men. 38 percentage points for women, that's the difference, the delta here, and the delta for the men is 17 percentage points. So let me sum up this very complex history. In 1960, few recognized that there was discrimination with regard to sex. Women began to adopt the term oppression from the civil rights movement. That's okay. Good thing it wasn't on the table. Women began to adopt the term oppression from the civil rights movement. But the civil rights movement, as I said, did a lot more for women. It fortuitously gave them Title VII of the Civil Rights Act and gave them the EEOC. That led to the formation of the National Organization for Women. With the end of protective legislation, it led to the passage of the Equal Rights Act and a huge list of women's rights gains, even from the Supreme Court. In part, that was due to the fact that women had electorate clout after 1960. But it also led, as I said, to a more radicalized women's movement and the rise of anti-feminist organizations. Even though it is hard to show convincingly that rights led to change, it is also hard to believe that the well-being of most women did not improve because of the expansion of these rights. It is likely that the actions of the traditionalists have diminished the ability of women to fully use these rights, for example, by probably preventing the funding of universal pre-K and paid parental leave. But it is also hard to believe that we would all be in this room today had our rights remained as they were in 1962. So thanks very much.
Hi, I'm Professor Amatangelo. I'm teaching the intro to gender, sexuality, and women's studies right now. Mine is a very naive question, but we've been talking about all of this in class. So the Equal Pay Act
The EPA, yeah.
is from 1963.
Yes.
So what has that served? We know that we still don't have equal pay for equal work.
No. You don't know if we don't have equal pay for equal
Okay.
work. We don't have equal pay. That doesn't necessarily mean we don't have equal pay for equal work.
Okay.
So the EPA, which is actually also part of Title VII in a very convoluted way through something called the Bennett Amendment, means that the EEOC, when they decide whether to press charges, is using the EPA, okay? So that's where it becomes important. So the EEOC can look around, or someone can come to them and say, I am doing the same job as this other person, exactly the same, in this establishment, okay? So it is a bit of a straitjacket in the sense that it doesn't say that it's across establishments, and it doesn't use the term comparable. Mm-hmm. There's a famous Supreme Court case, Gunther, which brings back the word comparable. So the Equal Pay Act was stalled in Congress from 1945 because it had the word comparable in it, for comparable work. And the question is, what is comparable work? Equal work makes, some people think that it's easier if it's equal, and it has to have the same title, it has to be in the same place, et cetera.
Okay, thank you very much.
Okay, but why it is that you can still have differences may have nothing to do with the EPA.
Right, so it's something that a woman can go to as, to challenge how she's being compensated.
Yes.
But otherwise,
You go to the EEOC.
it doesn't hold employers to any standards in terms of how they compensate.
Well, it does, because employers don't want to be
risk of being
sued. They have deep pockets.
Right, okay.
They could be sued. I mean, there are some very famous cases. There's a famous case against General Motors. There's a famous case against AT&T. Okay, the EEOC brings charges, and they don't want to, they do not want this to be major headline news. They do not want to be investigated, so they say, okay, we will have a fund of $30 million to go to individuals, blah, blah, blah. Okay.
Got it, thanks.
In the beginning of the presentation, you mentioned how some women nowadays are confused when you say why women won.
Yes.
Do you find that they change their minds, or maybe have or they understand once you tell them or show them about how much things have actually changed over the last 60 years?
Well, it's only when I give this talk. I don't go around. I don't go around saying to people. By the way, I don't go into the train station in Boston and have a big sign that say, women won, and people come up to me and ask me, what do you mean women won? Okay, so why don't you ask the women in this room, or anyone? That's a question for them, not for me.
Okay, thank you.
I think it's hard, whatever your name is, I'm going to call you Philip. It's Philip, it's hard. It's very, very hard for Joanne here to imagine what life was like when a whole set of rights were not recognized. And it wasn't that long ago. It was, in fact, the 1990s. Okay, for you, that was long ago, I know. But in the 1990s, there's a famous Supreme Court case about what sexual harassment is. And up until then, the notion is that workplaces have relationships, and some of these relationships are sexual relationships. And women can be sexy, and we shouldn't sort of stop that. We can't. It's very, very difficult to do that. And so the question is, what constituted harassment in the workplace? And it wasn't until that late, despite the fact that Title VII is passed earlier in Congress, some people think that it covers sexual harassment, but that had to be sort of defined. So it's hard for you to understand and go back to a time when it was sort of okay. It was just sort of okay. It was sort of the normal way things happened in workplaces. Well, it shouldn't be the normal way, okay? And it shouldn't be the normal way in universities either. Okay. I could see the question that came to the top of your, I could see it.
I was percolating.
Yeah.
My name's Elizabeth. I'm a librarian here at the Holy Cross. And I guess with those graphs that you had where you see the, men and women both agreeing more and more, you talked about the passing of Roe v. Wade, and in the current political climate with the retraction or overturning of Roe v. Wade, I can't help but think that maybe those lines are going to start to come down. Like maybe they've
Well, for
maybe
some
they've
of
hit the
them,
height.
most of these are still up there. I mean, the question is, how could anyone say that women shouldn't work when women are working?
Right.
Or they shouldn't work with a preschool child when in fact they do work with preschool children. We don't see, this isn't a case in which we have, although truth be told, we had a horrible thing happen in New York City in a daycare center recently, right?
Yep. Okay. It was just a thought.
Yeah. No,
A scary thought,
but as I said, there are different groups. We are not, have never been, and we are not a unified nation. And so, fascinating, in the early 1970s, Congress was sort of unified in terms of women's rights and thinking that it was very, very important to be behind women's rights. Emanuel Seller, who was a Democrat from New York, was the head of the House Judiciary Committee, which is the highest ranking representative. He served for 50 years. He was elected first in 1923 when the Equal Rights Act was first introduced into Congress. In 1971, he voted against the Equal Rights Act. He was one of 15. He's a Democrat. He's a liberal, okay? He voted against it. And out of nowhere, a very, very green individual in terms of her political expertise, named Elizabeth Holtzman, 30 years old, runs against him in a primary and defeats him on the basis of essentially that. There was a sense in America in 1971-72 that you were electable if you supported women's rights. Mm-hmm. But in fact, women were, as you saw, deeply divided. It's just that other group had not yet appeared. We are that way now. There are two sides. Okay.
Thank you.
Yes.
Hi. As you know well, women are behind in the United States, behind our peers in many other developed and wealthy countries on a multitude of indicators, right? The percentage of women in our Congress is lower than the percentage of women in most European parliaments and many Latin American parliaments. The rates of maternal mortality for women here are worse than almost anywhere in Europe.
Yeah, our health care system stinks.
It is. Oh, absolutely,
Okay,
absolutely.
given how much we pay for it.
Absolutely.
I don't think that has much to do with women, but that's okay.
Okay.
Yeah.
So,
Because it stinks for men, it stinks for blacks. Okay.
okay. Any number of indicators, as you know, where countries are moving their abortion rights
Yes,
rules in one way
that's
or
right.
another.
That's
The
right.
U.S. is kind of an outlier in getting rid of abortion rights, where most of Latin American countries that are making
Yeah,
a
it's
change are
amazing.
moving in the opposite
Catholic
direction.
countries. That's
Absolutely.
Right. Yeah.
So the point being, on many indicators that I think
Yeah.
most people in the room would think are
Yes.
important, right?
Yeah.
The American women are very behind. So I
Yeah,
guess
but American women, as I just pointed out, are not a unified group.
That's a different question. That's a question of what they want. But those indicators, right, you might be as
Yes.
likely to die as a pregnant woman, whether you're a traditionalist or a non-traditionalist, right?
Yeah, but let's put that in, I do not think that that's part of this. Because
Okay,
you're more likely to die of prostate cancer if you're a black man
okay.
than if you're a white man. There are lots of things that we
Right.
could list that are horrible disparities.
Okay,
Yeah.
political representation, like in Congress, which is a
No,
total
that's
outlier?
fine.
Okay.
Yeah.
So my question is, where women are doing much worse than many of the countries with
Yeah.
which we would compare ourselves, your story would tell us that the last time we had a big move forward,
Yes.
right, with those 45% was in the 60s to 70s. And if I understood your argument correctly, that was largely, or an important part of that story was women getting organized
That's right.
because of what, in large part because of what they learned from the anti-war movement protests, civil rights movements, et cetera. So bringing us to today, we have any number of things that American women,
Right.
now speaking, especially about women who want to increase women's, right, not difference feminists, right?
Right.
Where do you see, or do you see, like, where does the next, we are in the middle of a racial
I
justice
think it's by
reckoning. Where does it come
states.
from?
So
Yeah.
let's think about, this is an amazingly important question. Let's think about where we're really behind. We're behind in so many of the things that we think of we're behind in. Labor force participation. That's coming from the fact that we don't have subsidies for childcare. Labor force, we do not have paid parental leave. We have guaranteed parental leave. So why, and those are the areas that countries that used to be way behind us in terms of women's labor force participation, France, for example, are now way ahead of us because they have more universal childcare, highly subsidized, good, high-quality childcare. That's why the Nordics are way ahead. How can we get that? Oops. The only way that we can get that in this terribly divided country is at the state level. So this has to happen at the state level. We're not going to get it at the federal level. We're just much too divided.
So if I could ask a follow-up then, it sounds like you're saying, correct me if I'm wrong, that might be the type of model we're already seeing on abortion rights, right?
Yes, that's right.
And at the federal level, but even in red state after red state where it's been brought forward as referenda, it's been defeated.
Right.
Not to mention many blue states have moved
Yeah.
to enhance their protections. Is that the kind of model you see on child care, family leave?
Well, that's the kind of model that we have seen. We have a large number of states now that have passed mandates for paid parental leave. They're not super high payments. I mean, it's firms themselves that are joining the bandwagon for paid parental leave. But that's little relative to subsidized daycare. For the people who say, oh, America's behind in paid parental leave, I say children are not one-year capital goods, okay? You need a lot more than 6 months or 1 year. You need subsidies for, we are not a country in which your kids are my kids and my kids are your kids. That's the problem. Okay, we are simply a very divided nation. Sure.
I had a question about the probability density function, because I think you were saying that as they get more rights, that the movement will become more radical. So then I was wondering why it also shows that on the surveys more people are identifying as feminists as we've gotten more rights.
Yeah, but yes, that's a very, very good point, but it's pretty sort of flat. So one has to sort of get into what people are thinking about the word feminism. But it seems to me that fewer people are identifying as feminists. It's really a very, very low number relative to what they think women are capable of doing. Right? Yeah. Sure. And thanks for taking the model seriously. Okay.